and that really, this is the question that I want to start off with more at a high level. The reason being, I've realized if anyone's going to ask from me from now onwards, what is philosophy of science, or can I have a bit of a brief introduction, I just tell them to read chapter one of the Knowledge Machine, because one of my favorite chapters where you go through the kind of the history of, well, really 20th century science and this quote unquote great method debate. So I'd love for you to, Michael, maybe like expand and lay down. We've probably done this many times in previous podcasts, so I apologize if you gotta repeat yourself. The debate between Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn, and what's this ongoing great method debate in the philosophy of science?
I think it all began when a lot of intellectuals in the 20th century were looking at the mess that the human race had made of, or at least the kind of the European part of the human race had made of the world, and this is actually particularly after the First World War. That's why I'm emphasizing Europe, and decided that what they needed to do was to rebuild everything on rational principles, and at that time that really meant scientific principles for them. And so this question came up: what are scientific principles? What is it to go about, for example, constituting a state scientifically, or drawing up a moral code scientifically? And those are deep, complicated questions that I don't have answers to, and I wasn't writing about in my book. But of course, it turned all of these philosophers into philosophers of science. They had to say, here is the right way to go about gaining knowledge, the scientific way, as opposed to the other way. So they wanted to be able to write down, in effect, some rules for inquiry. Not necessarily a complete guide to inquiry, but some kind of set of rules that was distinctive enough to separate science from all the rest. And what I call the great method debate begins there, with the attempt to say what the scientific method is in a way that differentiates it from all other forms of inquiry. And after the early difficulties in doing that turned into a big debate about whether there even was a scientific method. And you can see one way to look at Popper's and Kuhn's work is this: that Popper was someone who thought he knew what the scientific method was, and he is a paradigm of one of these thinkers who wanted to make the world scientific. He wrote, and he did write on politics as much as he did on science. But anyway, he's someone who believes there's a scientific method, and he can tell you what it is, and that the right sort of critical, rational, scientific mind is the one that applies this method. And probably more than anyone else in the history of, well, at least in the history of 20th century philosophy of science, Thomas Kuhn is identified as someone who undercut Popper's project. But Kuhn is not a negative philosopher. He has his own, actually quite sophisticated story about how science works, but it's really deeply different from the kind of the standard method story. And in fact, it's a story in which scientists don't come out looking like these kind of critical rationalists, but something rather different. And we can talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but rather than diving into it, I just really want to stress this contrast between, on the one hand, this single scientific method that's the epitome of critical inquiry with Popper, and then with Kuhn there's a distinctive social organization in science, but it actually involves many different methods at different times, so there's not one unchanging method. And furthermore, that setup is almost, you might say, well, if not irrationalist, then there's many elements to it that seem quite at odds with Popper's very heroic view of scientific inquiry as I say, the apex of rationality.
Yeah, I mean, after all, Popper was also a political philosopher, right? I mean, I've read his book, Open Society and Its Enemies. Anyway, the book on totalitarianism, and he even calls Plato the person who started all of totalitarianism. So it's quite interesting. So Professor Stevens, if you could start with Popper, and then of course the unfalsifiability principle. Now, anyone could. I don't think it's that hard, even for a layperson like myself, to just Google what it means and get a very elementary understanding. So perhaps you could firstly just explain what the Karl Popperian unfalsifiability principle is, but then also, as you've done in the book rather well, maybe lay down some of your criticisms of it, just for the audience.
Yeah, sure. So Popper thought that really the heart of this, the scientific method, was this very simple idea that if a theory makes a false prediction, it has to be wrong somehow. And Popper thought at the core of scientific inquiry was the systematic elimination of all of the false theories. And notionally, of course, you could imagine one day having eliminated them all and just having one true theory remaining, although as Popper was understood as well as anyone, that was not a realistic prospect. But he thought we could at least think of ourselves as making progress by eliminating the false theories. So the thing that makes that, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, please continue. I want to kind of follow up on that, but keep going. Yeah.
Okay. So the thing that makes that, though, now turning to where he begins to run into difficulties, and he had plenty of things to say about these difficulties. It's not as if this is some sort of one-shot undermining of his view, but it's really difficult when a theory does make a false prediction to figure out whether it was really the theory's fault or not. Science is such a complicated thing, and in particular, the kinds of measurement apparatus that are used to make observations in cutting-edge science are often very complicated, fragile things that only work when conditions are exactly right. 99.9% of the time, when you get a false prediction, it's not really the theory's fault at all. It's just that something went wrong with the apparatus, or maybe you made a false assumption when you were making your calculations, or maybe even, and this does happen, there's an error in the software that you're using to analyze your results. And so it's not really the theory's fault or not. And it would be a terrible mistake to throw away the theory just because you got this false prediction. So if you're going to capture the spirit of Popper's proposal, you have to figure out some way of deciding when it's okay to just say, oh, something went wrong with the apparatus, and when you should say, oh no, this time it's the theory's fault, and so we've falsified the theory, as he says. We can throw away the theory. Sometimes, of course, you can just see that something went wrong with the apparatus, like, it's smoking, making crackling noises. Yeah. But often, in many cases in the history of science, we have results that were anomalous and looked like they caused problems for theories, and we'll never know what went wrong because it's just too late to go back and check. I'm sure we'll probably end up talking about some examples later on, but this Popper really never fully satisfactorily answered this question of when it's okay to blame the apparatus or other assumptions, and when you should blame the theory. I think he had interesting substantive things to say, but he didn't succeed in writing down what he was really after, which was a kind of a systematic calculus, if you like, for making these decisions, something that took these decisions out of the hands of scientists who might be indulging in motivated reasoning, trying to see their own theory in a good light, and just sort of said, no, you must follow this logic, and this logic says your theory is wrong.
Yeah, because I haven't read his book where he introduced the principle, what's it called, the logic of science, I believe, but
logic of scientific discovery, it's called.
That's it. Yeah, I haven't read that book, although my understanding, again, at a very elementary level, is that it seems that Popper really wanted some kind of a priori principle or even theory of science that allows scientists to do science. And then what you would argue for, and many others, would be that, oh, well, unfortunately, for better or worse, let's say, we haven't found that.
Yeah. And so what you in fact have is, I kind of made it all sound more like a philosophical argument, but the fact of science is you have real arguments over these things, whether probably a result is just an artifact of some problem with the measuring apparatus, or the theory really is in trouble. In fact, that's almost more normal than any other state of affairs. So typically the scientists who performed perform the experiment will trust the apparatus more than the scientists sort of a few labs over who weren't there to kind of see it all operating and so on. And in the end, if scientists keep going for long enough, there does seem to be a kind of a consensus that forms. The experiments get done enough times by enough different people. It's not as if we're just totally at sea, but it doesn't have this simple, crisp, objective, algorithmic feel to it that Popper was really reaching for.
Yeah. Well, I guess that leads us to, I don't know if I should call it the antithesis, but at least let's say we'll juxtapose Thomas Kuhn's theory, the paradigm shift, the term that he popularized, with the Popperian principle. So the structures of scientific revolutions, perhaps my favorite book on philosophy of science. Yours is a healthy contender.
I'll take that.
So in contrast to Karl Popper, Professor Shrevens, how does Thomas Kuhn differ? Because he came after Popper, isn't that right? So, and what were his views? Yeah.
So Popper wrote his book in the 1930s, and Kuhn wrote his book in the 1960s, to give you some sense. So Popper is in a way essentially interwar, I suppose we would now say, and Kuhn is very much post-war.
Yeah.
And Popper was still kind of firing on all cylinders by then, but he wasn't presenting whole new ideas. Well, he was entitled to kind of have a break. So Kuhn's idea is actually, it doesn't dispense with the idea of a scientific method, as I was saying earlier, but rather the idea is that at any particular time period, a science, say like particle physics or molecular genetics or economics, maybe microeconomics, will have a particular method, a particular set of rules for doing science, and actually a rather comprehensive set of rules for doing science. But that these methods are not fixed for all time. In fact, they change in episodes from time to time in dramatic episodes called scientific revolutions, or the phrase that Kuhn famously popularized for this is a paradigm shift. And the paradigm here is this kind of big method for doing science. And when it shifts, that means the old paradigm has crumbled and a new one comes along and replaces it. So whereas Popper and the classic searchers for a scientific method were looking for a single rule that is valid for all time, as you said, hopefully a priori, one that we can just know is right with certainty. Kuhn thought these methods only last for a while, and then their scientists actually push them to the point where all of their flaws are exposed, because they're very rich, but they're also kind of limited. They have a lot of assumptions built in, and inevitably some of those assumptions will turn out to be wrong. And so scientists push them to their breaking point. And in effect, they destroy their own methods by exposing the faulty assumptions or whatever. And then some new method has to come along and supplant the old method. A new paradigm comes along and supplants the old paradigm. That's a paradigm shift. That's a scientific revolution. Then you have a whole new methodological complex governing what scientists do in whatever area of science it is.
So in this way of paradigm shifting, would it be, because it's not fair to say, like, for instance, from the Newtonian worldview of classical mechanics, let's say, to now with quantum theory, quantum mechanics, is that really a paradigm shift, or is a paradigm shift something where we have like an epochal, something like from Aristotelian science or physics to what we have in modern science? Because the reality is we still, despite living now in the paradigm, let's say, of quantum theory and quantum mechanics, we still subscribe to certain Newtonian principles, for sure, right? And it's not like we've completely dismissed that. So how did, perhaps maybe like flesh out a bit more what really is a paradigm shift?
Yeah, well, I think that the change that is most central and to a paradigm shift, although it's not the only change, is a change in a kind of a whole theoretical conception of how the world works. So although on the superficially quantum mechanics or equally Einstein's general theory of relativity, so that the kind of the successor theory to Newton's work on gravitation in particular, although that preserves a lot of what Newton said in the sense of making the same predictions, the theoretical underpinnings look really different. So I'll do it with gravity. In Newton, there's this force that objects with mass exert on one another. They pull one another, and that's gravity, and it causes them to accelerate, and as spelled out by Newton's second law. But in Einstein's theory that replaced Newton's theory, there's no force directly between objects like that. Instead, objects impart this twist or curvature to space-time, and then other objects are trying to travel through that space-time, but because it's twisty, they themselves take a curvy path, which is just the path of, say, a body like the Earth orbiting the sun. Anyway, I probably shouldn't try to explain general relativity any further. But the point is, it's even though it makes a lot of the same predictions as Newton's theory, which it had better do, because Newton's theory made so many correct predictions. It's a really different way of thinking about what's going on, and that's kind of at the core of what makes it a new paradigm. But it suggests all of these new experiments that just wouldn't make sense in Newton's theory. So an example of that would be looking for the existence of gravitational waves. Einstein's theory predicts, because mass actually has an impact on space-time itself, when you have especially very dramatic events like two colliding black holes, will actually cause space-time itself to shiver, like throwing a rock into a pool. You get these waves that ripple outwards. So you should be able to detect those if you build a sensitive enough apparatus, which physicists finally succeeded in doing in about 8 years ago. I mean, they've been building it for about 50 years, but it finally detected gravitational waves in 2015. So you get all of these new ideas about what you might do with science. And that's characteristic of a paradigm shift. It's not just a set of new theoretical ideas, but all of these new ideas for actually doing science, new kinds of experiments or observations you could perform. So that's what makes that shift from, you mentioned quantum mechanics, and I kind of subtly changed the example just to gravity, because it's I think a bit more straightforward.
Yeah, the principle stands, yeah.
But the idea is it's the new paradigm manages to do on the surface, superficially, in terms of prediction and so on, a lot of what the old paradigm did, but gives you a whole new picture of the way the universe is working that makes sense of those predictions.
Yeah,
in fact, your method for doing science suggests all of these new experiments you might do and so on.
Yeah, I was thinking of like a more of a contemporary example of this, and I realized I'm reading this book also by Tim Maudlin, the philosopher of science, on quantum non-locality, and there's an interesting kind of story of Einstein, because John Bell, he mathematically proved quantum non-locality, I believe in the 80s or 90s. And then Tim Maudlin, he's like one of his, John Bell is like one of his heroes. And then I believe in the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to the laureates who proved quantum non-locality, it's a mouthful, experimentally. And then in the book, he talks about how Einstein didn't want to accept this idea of non-locality, because his theory was in fact local, and he called it spooky action at a distance. But then, of course, now that we have mathematical proof and empirical evidence, let's say, which kind of sticks to your iron rule of explanation, it seems like we're kind of going through that paradigm shift where, well, I guess physics isn't local anymore in the way we thought. And I find that endlessly fascinating, how it just completely shifts not only our theories, but just even at a very existential level, how we view the world and experience the world.
Yeah, that's a great example of a paradigm shift where you get this new kind of fundamental theoretical apparatus, quantum mechanics, and it makes these weird predictions about non-locality. And so it suggests all of these scientific experiments you might do that wouldn't have made any sense in Newtonian physics. And in particular, those Nobel Prize winning experiments that really established that the predictions of the theory really were accurate.